Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The fog hung thick over Baker Street that November evening in 1895, drifting up from the Thames like pale muslin and softening every gas lamp until they appeared as mere halos in the murk. Dr. Watson sat in his familiar chair beside the fire, watching the smoke from Holmes's pipe curl lazily toward the ceiling, while his friend's long fingers drummed an absent rhythm against the arm of his chair. The newspapers scattered upon the table spoke only of petty burglaries and political squabbles, nothing to stir the restless intellect that required constant stimulation. If anything was calculated to sour Holmes's disposition, it was an evening devoid of intellectual challenge. Holmes glanced across at his companion, and his keen grey eyes took in, with that swift and comprehensive sweep that so often struck strangers as supernatural, the details of Watson's boots, cuff, and collar in a single moment. The drumming ceased, and he leaned forward slightly. "You took the longer route from your surgery today," Holmes observed in that thin, precise voice. "You administered treatment to a child suffering from respiratory distress, likely croup, and lingered long enough to receive a mother's grateful embrace. The father works in construction, probably masonry?" Watson chuckled, though warmth coloured his amusement. "Really, Holmes, your methods never cease to amaze me. How do you possibly deduce such specifics?" "Elementary observation, my dear fellow. The chalk dust upon your right cuff indicates contact with limestone mortar, transferred by a handshake with someone whose trade involves such materials. The faint traces of camphor oil upon your lapel, combined with cotton wool fibers caught in your sleeve, suggest pediatric treatment involving respiratory remedies. The slight wrinkle in your coat at shoulder height bears the telltale impression of a woman's grateful embrace, and your delayed return, despite the threatening weather, indicates time spent in consolation rather than mere medical consultation." Before Watson could respond with his customary request for further explanation, Holmes's head turned sharply toward the door. His acute hearing had detected through the fog-muffled sounds of the street below the approach of visitors ascending their 17 steps with considerable urgency. "Clients, Watson," he murmured, his eyes brightening with interest. "The fog drives them to us like sheep to shelter. Let us hope they bring something more stimulating than domestic dispute." Mrs. Hudson ushered in 3 visitors: Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his usually neat appearance somewhat dishevelled by haste and weather, a distinguished gentleman of middle years whose bearing spoke of wealth and social position, and a young lady in mourning dress whose composure barely concealed profound distress. Her black-gloved hands trembled as she clutched her reticule, and even through her lowered veil, Watson could observe the tension in her posture. Holmes rose with that fluid grace which marked all his movements, his indifference falling away like a discarded cloak as his professional interest engaged. "Inspector Lestrade, always a pleasure when Scotland Yard brings genuine mysteries rather than mere complications. And you, sir, are clearly a man of business accustomed to authority, while the lady is in mourning for a family member, though not a husband. The matter must be grave indeed to bring such a delegation to Baker Street at this hour." Lestrade removed his hat, shaking droplets of moisture onto the carpet. "Mr. Holmes, I warned them you'd see through our little procession before we'd properly introduced ourselves. This is Sir Reginald Whitmore and his ward, Miss Catherine Harrington. We've come about a most extraordinary case, one that has left our finest investigators completely baffled." The young lady raised her veil, revealing intelligent hazel eyes clouded with grief and bewilderment. She was perhaps 25, with the refined features of good breeding and an underlying strength of character that commanded immediate respect. "It concerns my uncle, Mr. Aldrich Harrington," she said, her voice steady despite evident emotion. He was found dead yesterday morning in his locked study under the most peculiar circumstances. There was no sign of violence, no indication that anyone had entered the room. Yet the manner of his death defies all rational explanation." Holmes gestured toward the sofa with characteristic precision. "Pray be seated, all of you. Inspector, perhaps you would outline the essential facts before we delve into the more intriguing particulars." Lestrade consulted his notebook with evident frustration. Mr. Aldrich Harrington, aged 62, retired textile merchant of considerable wealth, was discovered dead in his study at Grosvenor Square. The door was locked from the inside, all windows securely fastened, and the chimney fitted with an iron guard that would prevent any human passage. The room was, by all appearances, completely sealed. "The cause of death?" Watson inquired, his medical training asserting itself. "Heart failure, according to the preliminary examination, though Mr. Harrington enjoyed robust health and had never complained of cardiac difficulties. What makes the case truly extraordinary, however, are the circumstances surrounding his death and certain objects found in the room." Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Continue, Inspector. I sense we approach the heart of the mystery." Mr. Harrington was found seated at his desk, apparently having collapsed while writing. In his right hand was clutched a pair of ladies' gloves, exquisite white kid leather of French manufacture. According to Miss Harrington and the household staff, these gloves belonged to no one in the residence, nor had anyone seen them before. Most disturbing of all, Mr. Holmes, several witnesses swear that when the gloves were handled, they produced a faint whispering sound as if the leather itself were attempting to speak. Miss Harrington shuddered visibly. "It's true, Mr. Holmes. I heard it myself when the constable lifted them from my uncle's grasp. A soft, sibilant whisper that raised the hair upon my neck. The servants are terrified, speaking of supernatural vengeance and cursed objects." "Fascinating," Holmes murmured, his eyes gleaming with that particular intensity Watson knew indicated a mind racing through possibilities and connections. "And had Mr. Harrington received any threats or warnings prior to his death?" Sir Reginald, who had remained silent during the initial recounting, now spoke for the first time. "3 letters arrived over the past fortnight, all bearing the same peculiar signature. The Whispering Gloves. They contained cryptic warnings about past sins and approaching judgment. We thought them the work of some unbalanced individual seeking to exploit Mr. Harrington's naturally nervous disposition." Holmes rose and moved to the window, his tall figure silhouetted against the fog-dimmed streetlight. "Inspector, I believe this case may prove more stimulating than our usual fare. The locked room, the mysterious gloves, the whispering sounds, and the threatening letters suggest a puzzle of considerable complexity. Watson and I shall accompany you to Grosvenor Square immediately. The scene must be examined before any evidence is disturbed or contaminated by well-meaning officials." As they prepared to venture into the fog-shrouded streets, Watson caught the familiar glint in his friend's eye that indicated Holmes had already begun to perceive patterns invisible to others. The case of the Whispering Gloves promised to test even the great detective's remarkable powers of deduction to their utmost limits. The hansom cab bore them swiftly through the fog-shrouded streets of London, wheels hissing against damp cobblestones as the gas lamps of Grosvenor Square emerged like distant beacons through the white veil. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his sharp profile etched against the window, as he observed the ghostly forms of late pedestrians dissolving into the mist. Watson noted his friend's familiar signs of intense concentration, the slight forward lean, fingers pressed together in their characteristic steeple, and that peculiar stillness indicating a mind working at extraordinary speed. Within minutes they arrived at number 14, a formidable Georgian townhouse whose soot-stained facade loomed from the fog with imposing dignity. Two constables stood guard at the entrance, their breath forming pale clouds in the frigid air. The house itself seemed to exhale an oppressive silence, that peculiar hush which death invariably imparts to even the grandest residences. Mrs. Pembroke, the housekeeper, met them at the door. Her usually stern composure appeared shaken, and Watson observed how her eyes darted nervously toward the upper floors as she ushered them inside. The entrance hall retained the mahogany-panelled elegance of established wealth, yet something indefinable in the atmosphere suggested that recent events had disturbed the household's careful order. "The study remains exactly as we found it, sir," Mrs. Pembroke informed Lestrade in hushed tones. "I've allowed no one to disturb anything, though I confess the servants grow increasingly reluctant to venture near that room. They speak of hearing whispers in the night, though I've told them such nonsense serves no useful purpose." Holmes's keen gaze swept the hallway, taking in every detail from the Persian carpet to the oil portraits of stern ancestors gazing down from gilded frames. "Mrs. Pembroke, had Mr. Harrington received any unusual visitors recently, beyond his normal social circle?" The housekeeper's weathered hands twisted her apron. "There was a young woman who called 3 times this past month, always during afternoon tea. Elegantly dressed she was, with a slight continental accent. She gave her name as Madame Dubois, though something in her manner suggested it might not be entirely truthful." Lestrade led them to the study door, breaking the temporary police seal with evident reluctance. The room beyond was a scholar's sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, their leather-bound volumes speaking of serious intellectual pursuits. A large mahogany desk dominated the centre, and there, slumped in his high-backed chair, sat the mortal remains of Aldrich Harrington. Holmes did not immediately approach the body. Instead, he performed his characteristic methodical circuit of the room, examining every surface with minute attention. He tested the window latches, noting their secure position, and inspected the fireplace where an iron guard was firmly bolted across the flue. The door showed splintered wood where the constable had forced entry, the key still visible in the inside lock. "Watson, your professional assessment, if you please," Holmes murmured, indicating the deceased with a slight gesture. Watson approached the body with practiced care. Mr. Harrington appeared to have collapsed while writing, his spectacles askew, his expression one of mild surprise rather than terror. The skin felt cool but not cold, consistent with Lestrade's timeline. Most significantly, the right hand still clutched the mysterious white kid gloves, their pristine appearance almost luminous against the dark mahogany of the desk. "Heart failure remains the most probable cause," Watson reported. "Though I detect no obvious signs of cardiac distress, there's an unusual dryness to the mouth and a faint flush to the cheeks that seems inconsistent with the circumstances." Holmes nodded, his attention now focused on the gloves themselves. Without touching them, he examined their construction through his magnifying glass, noting the mother-of-pearl buttons and the exceptional quality of the leather. As he leaned closer, a distinct whisper seemed to emanate from the kid, a soft, sibilant sound that raised the hair on Watson's neck. "French manufacture, undoubtedly," Holmes observed. "The stitching indicates Parisian craftsmanship of the highest order. Yet observe, Watson, how they maintain their shape despite being grasped by a dying man." With infinite care, Holmes used his handkerchief to ease the gloves from the rigid fingers. As he lifted them, that eerie whispering sound grew more pronounced. Turning them inside out revealed a fine dusting of powder that clung to the handkerchief. "French chalk," Holmes noted, "commonly used in glove manufacture, but there's something more here, a peculiar rigidity that suggests additional treatment." He folded the gloves carefully into paper, then turned his attention to the desk's blotter. Using a soft pencil rubbed against clean paper, he revealed the ghostly impression of the last words written. "Owe you satisfaction, E.V., and shall—" The sentence broke off abruptly. "E.V.," Lestrade exclaimed. "Edmund Vale, his former business partner. There was considerable animosity when their textile firm dissolved." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest, but he made no immediate comment. Instead, he knelt beside the carpet's edge, where his keen vision had detected something others had missed. With tweezers, he carefully extracted a single dark hair caught in the binding, curved like a minute question mark. "We are not yet at the heart of this mystery," Holmes said quietly, placing the hair in his pocketbook, "but we have begun to trace the correct path." Holmes remained motionless beside the carpet for several moments longer, his keen eyes tracing patterns invisible to his companions. The single dark hair he had discovered represented merely the first thread in what promised to be an intricate tapestry of deception. Rising with characteristic fluid grace, he moved to examine the positioning of the furniture with minute attention, noting how the heavy oak chair had been shifted perhaps an inch from its usual position relative to the desk, evidenced by slight indentations in the thick Persian rug. "Watson, observe the precise angle of the pen," Holmes murmured, his magnifying glass catching the lamplight as he studied the desk's surface. Not carelessly dropped in the throes of cardiac distress, but deliberately placed. The ink remains slightly viscous in the well, suggesting our Mr. Harrington was interrupted not by sudden collapse, but by something that commanded his immediate attention. The detective's examination revealed a faint residue of pale dust along the desk's inner edge, which he collected on his fingertip and subjected to careful scrutiny. French chalk, as I suspected, but combined with something more exotic. The crystalline particles suggest preparation far beyond mere glove manufacture. Lestrade produced the threatening letters at Holmes's request, along with a leather-bound household ledger retrieved by the efficient Mrs. Pembroke. Holmes spread the correspondence upon the cleared corner of the desk, his sharp eyes analyzing the spidery handwriting that ran through all three missives. Each bore the same theatrical signature and affected moral tone, speaking of stains that soap and steam cannot cleanse, and the account of Lille shall be balanced when the gloves start their whisper. Miss Harrington stepped forward with obvious reluctance when Holmes inquired about the Lille reference. "My uncle's mills contracted work in a suburb of that city several years past. There was a terrible accident during a workers' strike. 2 women perished in the machinery. Uncle Aldrich maintained the responsibility lay with the French firm, though many questioned his harsh judgment of the matter." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then turned his attention to the household ledger. His practiced eye swept the pages rapidly until he paused at a recent entry. "A parcel received yesterday at 6 o'clock from Monsieur Dubois, Paris, signed by Mr. Harrington himself." He looked up sharply. "Mrs. Pembroke, describe this parcel." The housekeeper twisted her apron nervously. "A small hat box, sir, tied with cream ribbon. Most elegant it was. I placed it upon the study table myself, and Mr. Harrington dismissed me immediately, locking the door behind me. He said he was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. Hat boxes seldom contain hats when malice is at work," Holmes observed, moving to the fireplace. Using the tongs, he carefully extracted a charred fragment of card from beneath the ashes. Despite the flame's damage, gilt script remained partially visible. "Gantz," followed by what appeared to be a Parisian address. "French gloves," he said softly, "and in this residue traces of violet-scented tissue paper. Our mysterious package contained more than mere accessories." The detective's attention was drawn to the bookshelf nearest the window, where several volumes showed signs of recent disturbance. Among them, a treatise on South American flora lay conspicuously open to a chapter concerning exotic plant alkaloids. Holmes examined the margin notes with particular interest. A feminine hand had annotated the text with observations about preparation and application of various compounds. "Miss Harrington," Holmes said without looking up from the botanical text, "you mentioned that Madame Dubois visited your uncle repeatedly. Can you provide more specific details about her behavior and interests?" The young woman's composure wavered slightly. She claimed to be researching Uncle's business connections, particularly those involving foreign suppliers. What troubled me was her persistent curiosity about his private papers and correspondence. She seemed less interested in historical research than in discovering specific information about past transactions. Miss Harrington paused, colour rising in her cheeks. "I must confess, Mr. Holmes, that something about her manner suggested her research was not entirely academic in nature." "Indeed. And did you observe her gloves during these visits?" "Why, yes, she was most particular about them. Always white kid leather of exceptional quality. I noticed because she handled them with such reverence, as if they were precious artifacts rather than mere accessories. She never removed them in my presence, which I found rather odd for afternoon tea." Holmes returned to the mysterious gloves, now carefully wrapped in paper, upon the side table. "The whispering sound that so disturbed the household staff is not supernatural in origin," he explained, his tone taking on the patient quality he reserved for educational moments. "The French chalk, combined with other substances, creates a unique friction when the leather is flexed or handled, a clever effect designed to unnerve and suggest otherworldly intervention where only scientific preparation exists." Watson felt both relief and disappointment at this rational explanation. But what purpose could such an elaborate deception serve? "That, my dear Watson, remains the central question. Terror is often calculation's most efficient servant, but whose calculation guides these events?" Holmes moved to examine the fireplace more closely, running his hand along the iron guard's bars. "Observe how remarkably clean these surfaces appear for a chimney that has seen years of use. There's an almost imperceptible sheen, as if treated with some form of polish or oil." Lestrade, who had been growing increasingly impatient, interjected, "Surely this is merely evidence of good housekeeping, Holmes. We have Edmund Vale's initials in the victim's final letter, his presence in the neighbourhood yesterday, and a history of animosity. Why complicate matters with exotic theories?" Holmes turned from the fireplace with that expression Watson recognised as barely contained irritation at premature conclusions. "Inspector, while Mr. Vale certainly warrants investigation, we must not allow apparent evidence to blind us to subtler truths. The preparation required for this crime suggests months of planning and intimate knowledge of the victim's habits. We are dealing with a mind of considerable sophistication and scientific knowledge." As they prepared to leave the death chamber, Holmes paused at the threshold, his penetrating gaze sweeping the room one final time. Something in his expression suggested that disparate threads of evidence were beginning to weave themselves into recognizable patterns, though he chose to keep his emerging theories to himself. The fog had thickened considerably during their examination, transforming Grosvenor Square into a realm of shadows and muffled sounds. As they descended the front steps, Holmes spoke quietly to Watson. "Tomorrow we shall pay calls upon 2 establishments, the Kensington address provided by our mysterious Madame Dubois, and a Bond Street dealer in continental imports. Between them I expect to learn whether our whispering gloves speak of conscience, calculation, or something far more dangerous." The gaslight caught the determined gleam in Holmes's grey eyes as they disappeared into the swirling mist, leaving behind a house of secrets that had begun to yield its carefully guarded truths to the greatest detective mind of the age. The November morning brought a crisp clarity to London's streets that seemed to sharpen Holmes's already keen faculties. Watson found his friend at the breakfast table, the mysterious gloves spread before him alongside his magnifying glass and a collection of chemical reagents. The detective's movements possessed that particular intensity which invariably preceded significant breakthroughs in his investigations. "Watson, observe these microscopic particles embedded within the French chalk," Holmes said without preamble, adjusting his lens to capture the morning light streaming through their Baker Street window. "Not merely limestone powder, but crystalline fragments that create controlled friction against the kid leather. The whispering effect is achieved through precise engineering rather than supernatural intervention." Watson examined the samples with professional interest, noting the deliberate craftsmanship evident in every detail. The preparation required suggests months of planning and considerable expertise in both chemistry and psychology. Indeed, our mysterious Madame Dubois possessed resources and knowledge far beyond the ordinary. The question remains whether she acted from personal vendetta or served as instrument of another's design. Holmes carefully rewrapped the gloves, his grey eyes already focused on the day's investigative objectives. "Two establishments await our attention, and I suspect both will illuminate the darker corners of this conspiracy." Their first destination proved to be a respectable boarding house in Kensington, its modest facade speaking of genteel circumstances rather than criminal enterprise. Mrs. Ashford, the landlady, received them with nervous courtesy, her description of the former tenant painting a picture of studied respectability concealing deeper mysteries. "Madame Dubois maintained most particular habits," Mrs. Ashford explained, her hands fluttering anxiously as she spoke. "Always elegantly dressed, though I noticed her French accent seemed to vary depending upon her mood. Some days quite pronounced, others barely detectable. She received few visitors, but those who came arrived after dark and spoke in whispers." Holmes examined the vacated chambers with characteristic thoroughness, his trained eye detecting traces that others might dismiss as inconsequential. Behind the washstand, he discovered fragments of violet-scented tissue paper identical to those found in Harrington's fireplace. More significantly, careful examination of the windowsill revealed dried plant matter of distinctly exotic origin. "She conducted chemical experiments here," Holmes observed, scraping the residue into a small envelope. "The ventilation pattern and staining suggest she was extracting alkaloids from South American botanicals, probably the same compounds referenced in Harrington's annotated text. As they prepared to depart, an unexpected encounter provided crucial intelligence. A young woman approached with obvious hesitation, her modest clothing and refined bearing suggesting education despite limited circumstances. She glanced nervously about before addressing Holmes directly. "Excuse me, sir, but I work at the millinery shop across the square and observed the French lady's activities with considerable interest. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I believe I possess information relevant to your investigation." Holmes's attention focused immediately upon this unexpected witness. "Miss Mitchell, we should be most grateful for any observations you can share." "Madame Dubois visited our establishment twice, ostensibly purchasing ribbon and trimmings. However, her true interest lay in questioning me about the neighbourhood's residents, particularly Mr. Harrington's household routines and correspondence habits. She seemed especially curious about his business relationships with Continental's suppliers." Miss Mitchell paused, colour rising in her cheeks. "What disturbed me most was her reaction when I mentioned Edmund Vale's recent visits to purchase mourning accessories. She became quite agitated and departed immediately without completing her purchase. This revelation struck Holmes with obvious significance. The web of connections was growing more complex, with Edmund Vale's apparent motive balanced against evidence of sophisticated conspiracy involving exotic preparations and elaborate theatrical effects. Their subsequent visit to the Bond Street establishment specializing in continental imports provided additional crucial pieces to the puzzle. Mr. Pemberton, the proprietor, proved most cooperative when Holmes explained their official connection to Scotland Yard's investigation. Madame Dubois was indeed a valued customer, Pemberton confirmed, consulting his meticulously maintained ledger. She purchased items of exceptional quality, French kid gloves of the finest manufacture, specialized chemical apparatus for extracting plant essences, and most unusually a German treatise on South American alkaloid compounds. Holmes leaned forward with keen interest as Pemberton produced the detailed invoice. Beyond the gloves and chemical equipment, she had acquired several pounds of French chalk, violet-scented tissue paper, and precision glassware designed for distillation processes. The order included specific instructions, Pemberton continued, retrieving a duplicate card from his files. Written in her hand, but with additional notations in different script, siffle, doucement, whisper softly in French. Most curious was the presence of initials EV and the Grosvenor Square address, apparently added by another party. Holmes examined the card with his magnifying glass, noting the subtle differences in penmanship that suggested multiple contributors to the order. Did anyone else inquire about this particular commission? A gentleman called later to confirm delivery details. Middle height, clean-shaven with a small scar at the chin, and a nervous habit of tapping his fingers. He gave the name Edmund Vale, though something in his manner suggested the information might not be entirely truthful. As they emerged onto Bond Street's bustling thoroughfare, Watson could observe Holmes's mind racing through the implications of their morning's discoveries. The case was revealing layers of deception and misdirection that suggested criminal intelligence of remarkable sophistication. "The pattern begins to emerge, Watson," Holmes murmured as they hailed a hansom cab. "We are dealing with a conspiracy that employs both psychological terror and scientific precision. The gloves themselves represent merely the visible instrument of a more complex mechanism designed to exploit human weakness and guilt." Holmes paused, his penetrating gaze focused on some distant point as disparate threads of evidence wove themselves into recognizable patterns. Consider the methodology. Harrington, haunted by past transgressions, receives cryptic warnings that prey upon his naturally nervous disposition. The arrival of whispering gloves, imbued with both supernatural suggestion and chemical preparation, creates a perfect storm of psychological pressure. The victim literally frightens himself to death, believing himself tormented by voices from beyond the grave. But who possesses both the knowledge and motive to orchestrate such an elaborate scheme? Watson inquired. That, my dear fellow, remains the central question. However, I suspect our afternoon appointment with Edmund Vale will prove most illuminating, particularly given Miss Mitchell's observations about his recent activities and the mysterious notations on Madame Dubois' order. Holmes's grey eyes held that familiar gleam, indicating he was beginning to perceive the true shape of the mystery hidden beneath layers of careful misdirection. "The game, as they say, is afoot, and I believe we are approaching the moment when our quarry must reveal themselves or risk losing control of their carefully constructed deception." The detective's expression suggested that while the surface of the mystery had been disturbed, far deeper currents of guilt, revenge, and calculated malice remained to be explored before the truth could be fully brought to light. The hansom cab deposited them before a modest Georgian townhouse in Bloomsbury, where the afternoon shadows fell across windows that spoke of genteel circumstances reduced by financial misfortune. Edmund Vale's residence bore the subtle signs of a man maintaining appearances despite diminished means, once fine furnishings now showing wear, and an atmosphere of careful economy that could not quite disguise former prosperity. Vale himself proved to be a man of perhaps 45 years, his clean-shaven face bearing the distinctive scar at the chin that Mr. Pemberton had described with such precision. His nervous energy was immediately apparent in the restless drumming of his fingers against the chair arm and the slight tick that flickered at the corner of his left eye whenever direct questions were posed. Watson noted how his hands, though well maintained, seemed perpetually in motion, betraying an inner agitation that his composed manner sought to conceal. "Gentlemen, I confess your visit was anticipated," Vale admitted as he ushered them into his cramped sitting room. "The newspapers spoke of Harrington's death, and I feared my past association would inevitably draw official attention." His voice carried the careful modulation of a man accustomed to choosing his words with precision, yet underneath lay currents of barely suppressed anxiety. Holmes settled into the offered chair with deceptive casualness, though his keen gaze absorbed every detail of Vale's demeanour and surroundings. "Mr. Vale, we understand there was considerable animosity following the dissolution of your textile partnership. Perhaps you would illuminate us regarding the specific nature of your disagreement with the deceased." Vale's composure cracked visibly at this direct approach, and his nervous finger-tapping increased in tempo. "Harrington destroyed me, Mr. Holmes, through calculated betrayal disguised as business necessity. When our French contracts encountered difficulties following the Lille incident, he manoeuvred to place all liability upon my shoulders while preserving his own interests." His voice grew bitter with remembered injustice. "2 women died in machinery that I had specifically warned required immediate repair, yet he testified that such concerns had never been raised." "Marie Dubois and her sister Claudette," Watson observed, noting how Vale's face drained of colour at the mention of these names. "They perished because Harrington prioritized profit margins over worker safety," Vale continued, his hands now clenched tightly in his lap. "Their families received no compensation, and I was left to bear both financial ruin and moral responsibility for deaths that could have been prevented. The guilt has haunted me these 5 years since." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes sharpening with interest. "A burden that would make a man susceptible to suggestions of justice or revenge. Tell me, Mr. Vale, how do you explain your initials appearing on commercial orders placed by our mysterious Madame Dubois?" The trapped man's shoulders sagged in defeat. "I confess to that much, though I was merely following instructions received through anonymous correspondence. I was told that justice for the Lille victims required my cooperation in a plan that would force Harrington to confront his crimes without physical violence." Vale produced a small bundle of papers from his desk drawer, each written in feminine script that promised divine retribution and moral reckoning. "The letters convinced me that Marie Dubois' spirit sought justice through earthly instruments, and that my cooperation would finally balance the moral scales. I was instructed merely to confirm delivery details and ensure that certain items reached their intended destination." Holmes examined the correspondence with his magnifying glass, noting the psychological manipulation evident in every carefully chosen phrase. "Mr. Vale, I fear you have been used as an unwitting tool in someone else's design. These letters represent manipulation of the highest order, designed to exploit your guilt and desperation." Rising to examine the window, Holmes's sharp profile caught the afternoon light as he considered the implications. His trained eye had not missed the subtle changes in Vale's appearance, the altered crease in his collar suggesting a different valet, the faint aroma of unfamiliar tobacco, and most tellingly, the slight indentation on his middle finger where a signet ring had recently been removed. "You have changed several of your habits recently, Mr. Vale," Holmes observed with characteristic precision. "Financial pressure, no doubt, has forced certain economies. Your alibi for yesterday evening?" "The Alhambra Theatre," Vale replied promptly, producing ticket stubs from his pocketbook. I dined at the Café Royal with Mr. Felix Hart, a silk factor, and afterward we attended the ballet. The stage manager, Mr. Lorimer, knows me well and will confirm our presence." Before Holmes could pursue this line of inquiry further, the sound of rapid footsteps on the stairs announced unexpected visitors. Inspector Lestrade entered with his characteristic brusque efficiency, followed by Miss Harrington, whose composed demeanour had been replaced by obvious agitation. She clutched a leather portfolio with trembling hands, her face pale with recent discoveries. "Holmes, we've uncovered documents in Harrington's private safe that transform the entire scope of this investigation," Lestrade announced without preamble. "Miss Harrington insisted upon bringing them to your attention immediately." Miss Harrington stepped forward, her voice unsteady as she opened the portfolio. "Mr. Holmes, I fear my uncle's death represents only the beginning of a more terrible design. These papers reveal connections to other textile manufacturers who were involved in the Lille incident, and each has received similar threatening correspondence signed with the mysterious Whispering Gloves." Holmes accepted the documents with keen interest, his trained eye rapidly absorbing their contents. Among them were copies of correspondence between multiple British textile firms, insurance documents related to the Lille tragedy, and most significantly, a list of names with dates marked beside each entry. Harrington's name bore yesterday's date, while 3 others remained ominously unmarked. "We are dealing with a systematic campaign of revenge," Holmes announced, his voice carrying that particular authority that commanded immediate attention. Harrington's death was merely the first movement in a larger symphony of retribution. The true danger lies not in what has already occurred, but in what our mysterious conductor plans for their remaining targets. Watson felt a chill of recognition as the true scope of the conspiracy became apparent. Then Vale's manipulation was designed not merely to provide a scapegoat, but to establish a pattern that could be repeated with other victims. "Precisely, Watson. Our adversary possesses not only scientific knowledge and theatrical flair, but also the patience and resources to orchestrate multiple elaborate schemes. They have studied their target's psychological vulnerabilities with the thoroughness of a physician diagnosing disease." Holmes's grey eyes held that familiar gleam indicating his mind was racing ahead to perceive connections that would remain invisible to others until he chose to reveal them. As they prepared to depart Vale's residence, Holmes turned back to the nervous man with a final observation. "Mr. Vale, you will remain available to Scotland Yard and will immediately report any further contact from your mysterious correspondent. Your cooperation may yet prevent additional tragedies." The case of the Whispering Gloves had transformed from a single, mysterious death into something far more sinister and far-reaching in its implications. Holmes's expression suggested that while they had begun to understand the mechanism of the conspiracy, the true identity and ultimate objectives of their adversary remained tantalizingly beyond reach. The urgency of their discovery propelled them immediately toward Baker Street, where Holmes could properly examine the documents Miss Harrington had retrieved from her uncle's private safe. The cab journey passed in tense silence, broken only by the detective's occasional sharp intakes of breath as he absorbed the implications of each revelation. Watson observed his friend's mounting concern with growing unease, recognizing the signs that indicated Holmes perceived dangers beyond their current understanding. Upon reaching their familiar quarters, Holmes spread the papers across his desk with methodical precision, creating a comprehensive map of the conspiracy that was beginning to reveal its true scope. The documents painted a picture of coordinated cover-up involving multiple textile manufacturers, insurance fraud, and systematic suppression of evidence related to the Lille tragedy. Most disturbing were the detailed biographical profiles of each targeted individual, complete with psychological assessments that demonstrated intimate knowledge of their personal vulnerabilities. Watson observed the meticulous preparation evident in these character studies, Holmes said, his finger tracing the careful annotations that accompanied each name. Our adversary has invested considerable time and resources in understanding not merely the business relationships of their targets, but their deepest fears, guilt, and psychological weaknesses. The profile of Sir Marcus Pemberton reveals a man haunted by recurring nightmares about machinery accidents, while Lord Ashworth's notes detail his obsession with locked doors and his fear of unexpected visitors. The anonymous author had documented intimate details that few people could possess. Harrington's habit of working late in his locked study, Sir Marcus's tendency to retreat to his fireplace when distressed, and Lord Ashworth's reliance on sleeping draughts to quiet his conscience. Each profile concluded with strategic recommendations for exploiting these vulnerabilities through carefully orchestrated psychological pressure. Holmes examined the marginal notes with his magnifying glass, comparing them to samples of the threatening letters they had previously encountered. The feminine script that had manipulated Vale was present, but additional annotations in a different hand suggested multiple participants in the conspiracy. Most significantly, certain technical terms related to chemical preparation appeared in what seemed to be a man's handwriting, indicating scientific expertise beyond what their mysterious Madame Dubois might possess alone. "We are dealing with a partnership," Holmes announced, his voice carrying that particular authority that indicated significant breakthrough. The psychological manipulation and theatrical elements suggest one mind, while the chemical expertise and detailed business knowledge point to another. Our adversaries have combined complementary skills to create a formidable alliance. Before anyone could respond to this revelation, Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door with obvious agitation. "Mr. Holmes, there's a young gentleman below who insists upon seeing you immediately regarding a matter of life and death. He says his name is Thomas Pemberton and that his father's life depends upon your immediate attention." Holmes exchanged a significant glance with Watson. "Sir Marcus's son, undoubtedly. Send him up immediately, Mrs. Hudson. The game accelerates beyond our expectations." Thomas Pemberton proved to be a man of perhaps 28 years, his resemblance to his father evident in his strong jaw and intelligent eyes. However, his usual composure had been shattered by recent events, and his hands trembled as he produced a small package wrapped in familiar violet-scented tissue paper. "Mr. Holmes, this arrived at our Belgravia residence 2 hours ago, addressed to my father with the same theatrical signature we've read about in the evening papers." Inside were a pair of white kid gloves identical to those described in the newspaper accounts, along with a note promising that the whispers of Lille shall be heard before midnight strikes. Holmes accepted the package with extreme care, noting immediately the evolution in the conspiracy's methodology. These gloves showed subtle refinements in construction, and when he examined the fireplace poker that Thomas had brought as evidence, he discovered a faint, varnish-like sheen along its surface. "Ingenious," Holmes murmured, scraping a tiny sample into a glass vial. "A resinous compound that softens with heat and releases its volatile contents when encouraged by flame. The visible gloves provide theatrical distraction, while the invisible agent does the deadly work. Your father's habit of retreating to his study fireplace when distressed makes him particularly vulnerable to this method." Holmes's examination revealed that the conspiracy had learned from Harrington's death and refined their approach accordingly. The psychological pressure had been intensified with references to specific traumatic memories, while the chemical preparation had been enhanced to produce more dramatic and immediate effects. "Where is Sir Marcus now?" Holmes inquired, already reaching for his coat. "Barricaded in his study, refusing to see anyone. The gloves have reduced him to a state of terror I've never witnessed in my father." Holmes gathered his investigative materials with mounting urgency. "Lestrade, I want immediate surveillance placed on Lord Ashworth and Mr. Morrison. Our adversaries work systematically, and time has become our most precious resource." The partnership behind these crimes possesses both the patience to plan elaborate psychological campaigns and the scientific knowledge to execute them with deadly precision. As they prepared to depart for the Pemberton residence, Holmes's expression carried that particular intensity Watson recognized as indicating his friend had begun to perceive the true shape of their adversary's design, though the most dangerous revelations still lay ahead. The hansom cab bore them through the fog-shrouded streets of Belgravia with unprecedented urgency, Holmes's sharp commands to the driver cutting through the November chill like a blade. Thomas Pemberton sat rigid beside them, his knuckles white as he gripped his walking stick, the weight of his father's peril etched in every line of his tense features. Watson observed his friend's characteristic stillness that preceded decisive action, noting how Holmes's grey eyes remained fixed on some invisible point as his mind raced through the implications of their refined adversary's evolving methodology. The Pemberton mansion loomed through the gathering dusk like a fortress under siege, its blazing windows unable to dispel the psychological darkness that had invaded its walls. Thomas led them through corridors lined with portraits of stern ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow the urgent procession toward the locked study where Sir Marcus had barricaded himself against what he believed to be supernatural vengeance. The very air seemed charged with tension, and Watson noted how the usually composed household staff moved with the nervous energy of people confronting forces beyond their understanding. Holmes paused at the heavy oak door, pressing his ear against the wood with characteristic precision. From within came the sound of restless pacing, punctuated by occasional muttered words that suggested a mind grappling with overwhelming guilt and chemically induced terror. More ominously, the detective's trained hearing detected the distinctive whisper of kid leather being repeatedly flexed, indicating that Sir Marcus had indeed handled the mysterious gloves despite their terrifying implications. "Sir Marcus," Holmes called through the door, his voice carrying that particular authority that had calmed countless desperate souls. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and I have come to discuss the true nature of your torment. The whispers you hear are not supernatural in origin, and the danger you face is entirely human in design." The pacing ceased abruptly, followed by silence that stretched for several heartbeats before Sir Marcus's voice emerged, cracked with strain and barely recognizable. "The gloves speak of Marie and Claudette Dubois, Mr. Holmes. They whisper accusations that pierce my soul with their truth. The fire shows me their faces, twisted in accusation. I cannot escape what I have done." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with Watson, recognizing the symptoms of advanced psychological manipulation combined with chemical influence. Their adversaries had refined their methods considerably since Harrington's death, employing more sophisticated pressure techniques designed to break their victims' resistance completely while maintaining the illusion of supernatural judgment. After several minutes of careful persuasion, the sound of furniture being moved away from the door indicated that Holmes's rational explanation had begun to penetrate Sir Marcus's terror. The man who emerged bore little resemblance to the confident industrialist Watson remembered from social gatherings. His hair was dishevelled, his clothing wrinkled from hours of anxious movement, and his eyes held the haunted quality of someone who had stared too long into the abyss of his own conscience. Holmes immediately noticed the telltale signs of chemical exposure: slight dilation of the pupils, a faint tremor in the hands, and the characteristic flush that indicated absorption of alkaloid compounds through the skin. Sir Marcus still clutched the white kid gloves, unable to release them despite their terrifying associations, his fingers working the leather with compulsive repetition that produced that eerie whispering sound. "The conspiracy has evolved, Watson," Holmes observed as he carefully extracted the gloves from Sir Marcus's grip, wrapping them in his handkerchief. "Observe the fireplace poker, that same varnish-like sheen we noted earlier, but applied with greater precision. The chemical preparation has been refined to work in conjunction with the victim's natural tendency to seek warmth and comfort when distressed." Using his magnifying glass, Holmes examined the hearth with methodical thoroughness. The andirons bore clear evidence of recent treatment, and a careful search revealed what appeared to be fragments of a small ceramic capsule among the coals. With infinite care, he used the tongs to extract the device, noting its ingenious construction, a hollow vessel designed to release its contents gradually when exposed to heat. "Remarkable engineering," Holmes murmured, placing the fragments in a specimen envelope. "A slow-release mechanism that ensures prolonged exposure to the hallucinogenic compound. The victim experiences increasingly vivid and terrifying visions while remaining physically capable of handling the prepared gloves, which provide additional chemical absorption through the skin." Before Holmes could complete his examination, rapid footsteps in the hallway announced urgent visitors. Inspector Lestrade burst through the door with obvious agitation, followed by a constable whose pale complexion suggested he had witnessed something deeply disturbing. The inspector's usual composed demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled alarm. "Holmes, we have a crisis that transforms everything we thought we understood about this case," Lestrade announced, without preamble. "Lord Ashworth has been found dead in his Mayfair residence under circumstances identical to Harrington's case. Locked room, mysterious gloves, and clear signs of terror-induced cardiac failure. The conspiracy has claimed its second victim while we were attempting to save the third." Holmes's expression darkened with the realization that their adversaries had anticipated police intervention and adjusted their timeline accordingly. The systematic nature of the campaign suggested not merely revenge, but a calculated demonstration of power designed to terrorize the surviving targets into complete submission while showcasing the conspiracy's ability to operate with impunity. "The partnership behind these crimes possesses remarkable organizational capabilities," Holmes said grimly, his mind already racing through the implications. "They have coordinated multiple simultaneous operations while maintaining perfect secrecy regarding their true identities. We are dealing with adversaries who combine scientific expertise with theatrical flair and possess intimate knowledge of their victims' psychological vulnerabilities and daily routines." Thomas Pemberton stepped forward with obvious distress. "Mr. Holmes, if they can strike at Lord Ashworth while we were focused on saving my father, what prevents them from completing their entire list? The documents mention Mr. Morrison as the final target, and if they can operate with such precision—" Holmes nodded gravely, his keen gaze already focused on patterns that would remain invisible to others until the moment of revelation. "The conspiracy has revealed both its capabilities and its limitations through tonight's actions. They require careful preparation and specific conditions to achieve their effects, which suggests vulnerabilities we might exploit. However, their ability to coordinate multiple operations simultaneously indicates resources and planning far beyond what we initially suspected." As Holmes gathered the evidence from Sir Marcus's study, Watson observed his friend's expression, carrying that particular intensity that indicated he had begun to perceive the true shape of their adversary's design. The case of the Whispering Gloves had evolved from mysterious death to systematic campaign of terror, revealing opponents whose sophistication and ruthlessness exceeded even Holmes's considerable experience with criminal masterminds. "The game has indeed changed, Watson," Holmes said quietly, as they prepared to depart for what might prove to be their final confrontation. Our adversaries have demonstrated their ability to strike multiple targets simultaneously while maintaining perfect coordination. The question now becomes whether we can identify and reach them before they complete their deadly symphony of revenge. The detective's grey eyes held that familiar gleam, suggesting he had begun to discern the true identities hidden behind the elaborate theatrical deceptions, though the most dangerous revelation still awaited discovery in the darkness ahead. Holmes moved with characteristic efficiency, directing that Sir Marcus be removed to a well-ventilated chamber under Watson's immediate care, while issuing rapid instructions to seal the contaminated study. The detective's trained eye had already absorbed every detail of the refined chemical preparation, and his mind raced through the implications of their adversaries' evolving methodology. As they departed the Pemberton residence, the urgency of preventing additional casualties drove them through fog-shrouded streets toward Lord Ashworth's Mayfair residence, where the conspiracy's latest triumph awaited their investigation. The scene at Lord Ashworth's townhouse possessed that ghastly familiarity which chilled Watson even as it focused Holmes's analytical powers. The peer had been discovered in his locked study, the door forced from within, after he failed to respond to repeated calls. Upon the mahogany desk lay the inevitable white kid gloves alongside a sheet bearing senseless scrawls that deteriorated into illegible panic before ending abruptly in a spreading ink blot. Holmes's examination proceeded with methodical precision, his trained senses detecting subtle refinements in the conspiracy's approach. The fireplace poker bore that familiar varnish-like sheen, while careful investigation of the coal revealed fragments of a ceramic capsule identical to those found at the Pemberton residence. Using delicate instruments, Holmes extracted a small paper twist sealed with violet wax from the grate's corner, noting the sophisticated engineering that ensured gradual release of hallucinogenic compounds. Tropane alkaloids, Holmes announced after testing ash samples with chemical reagents, the treated paper blooming to reveal the distinctive orange coloration. A belladonna derivative that excites terrifying visions in healthy men and proves fatal to those already weakened by guilt and irregular habits. The gloves provide additional absorption through skin contact, while the theatrical whispering effect maintains psychological pressure. The detective's attention focused on the violet tissue paper that had contained the gloves, tilting it toward the lamplight to reveal a delicate watermark, Maison Chavot, Rue de la Paix. More significantly, the inner lid of the delivery box bore traces of a hastily removed label reading Sut and Lye Exp, clearly indicating Sutton and Lyle Express service for private delivery. Holmes moved to examine the windowsill, where his keen eye detected a line of fine grit and an oval depression in the wood. A spyglass rested here recently, he observed, measuring the angle and height with characteristic precision. Our adversaries observed from that lodging house across the street, timing their intervention to ensure maximum psychological impact. Investigation of the indicated building confirmed Holmes's deduction, revealing a discarded newspaper, aniseed liqueur stains, and ribbons of violet tissue in the fireplace. However, the mysterious occupant had departed mere minutes before official arrival, described by the landlady as a woman in mourning with a soft, continental accent who moved light as thistledown and twice as difficult to catch. Holmes immediately dispatched messages to his network of street informants. To Wiggins and the Baker Street irregulars, he instructed the constable. Watch Sutton and Lyle's Covent Garden Depot and intercept any parcel addressed to Mr. Gilbert Morrison of St. John's Wood. The conspiracy operates through predictable channels that we can exploit. Their rapid journey to Morrison's residence revealed a man already consumed by terror, clutching a threatening letter that promised the hands that fed the machines shall be fed with justice. Upon his sideboard stood a violet-wrapped parcel, its ribbon cut and retied by nervous servants whose curiosity had been overcome by superstitious dread. Holmes examined the package with surgical precision, revealing white kid gloves and an empty inner box. "They grow bolder," he murmured, then turned his attention to other potential delivery mechanisms. His investigation of the bell pull revealed an oily residue that carried the bitter scent of exotic herbs, explaining how servants could unknowingly activate the chemical agents through routine household duties. The detective's strategic mind immediately grasped the conspiracy's vulnerability. Their psychological need for dramatic conclusion provides the weakness we require, Holmes explained to Watson as he arranged protective measures throughout Morrison's residence. They must observe their final triumph, which means positioning themselves within surveillance range. As Holmes donned a shabby disguise and positioned Lestrade's men at strategic points, a breathless messenger from Wiggins arrived with crucial intelligence. A Sutton and Lyle delivery had been intercepted and transferred to a woman in mourning who produced matching documentation before vanishing toward predetermined observation positions. "The instrument and the observation post," Holmes said with satisfaction, his grey eyes gleaming with anticipation. "We have them positioned between our surveillance and their escape routes. Now we discover whether they dare reveal themselves for their final performance." The case of the Whispering Gloves approached its climactic confrontation, with Holmes having transformed their adversary's methodical precision into the very trap that would expose their carefully guarded identities. The November darkness settled over St. John's Wood like a shroud drawn across the stage of their final performance, transforming the respectable residential street into a theatre where life and death would be decided by wit and preparation. Holmes had spent the afternoon converting Morrison's residence into an elaborate trap, his keen mind anticipating every move their adversaries might make while ensuring that no detail would escape his methodical surveillance. The detective himself had assumed the guise of a night watchman, his tall frame bent with assumed age as he maintained his vigil from a strategic position that commanded views of all approaches to the targeted residence. Within Morrison's study, Watson maintained careful watch over an ingenious deception that demonstrated Holmes's theatrical genius at its finest. A waxen bust, procured from Madame Tussaud's establishment, had been dressed in Morrison's smoking jacket and positioned before the fireplace, its profile carefully arranged to suggest a man lost in troubled contemplation. The actual Morrison had been spirited away to a secure lodging hours earlier, leaving behind only this convincing simulacrum to draw their enemies into the open. Holmes had neutralized every potential chemical delivery method with characteristic thoroughness. The fireplace andirons bore a protective coating of alkaline solution, the bell pull had been disconnected and examined for foreign substances, and the windows remained sealed against any attempt at external contamination. Most ingeniously thin wire ran beneath the Persian carpet, allowing Watson to produce occasional movements in the waxen figure that would satisfy distant observation while maintaining the illusion of a living, breathing target. The waiting proved more challenging than any direct confrontation, each passing hour stretching with the tension of a violin string approaching its breaking point. Holmes's network of street irregulars maintained their positions throughout the neighborhood, their seemingly casual presence masking a web of surveillance that would detect the slightest suspicious movement. The fog began to gather again as evening deepened, providing perfect cover for both hunters and hunted in the deadly game that was approaching its climax. At precisely 10 o'clock, the carefully orchestrated finale began to unfold with the mechanical precision that had characterized all their adversaries' previous operations. An elegant brougham drew to a halt 3 streets away, disgorging 2 figures who moved through the fog with the purposeful stride of those executing a long-rehearsed plan. Holmes observed their approach through his field glasses, noting the woman's mourning dress and the man's medical bag, both details confirming his deductions about the conspiracy's true nature. The woman proved to be the mysterious Madame Dubois herself, though her movements now carried the confident bearing of someone operating on familiar ground rather than maintaining a careful masquerade. Her companion was a lean gentleman of perhaps 50 years, his professional bearing and chemical-stained fingers immediately identifying him as the scientific expert whose annotations Holmes had discovered in Harrington's botanical texts. They positioned themselves in a vacant house directly opposite Morrison's residence, their chosen observation post providing perfect surveillance of their intended victim's study. Holmes signalled to his concealed allies with a subtle gesture, then abandoned his watchman's disguise with characteristic swiftness. His long strides carried him silently through the fog-shrouded garden, while Lestrade's constables moved to surround the observation post from multiple directions. The conspiracy's fatal weakness lay in their psychological need to witness their triumph personally, positioning them within reach of justice at the moment they believed themselves most secure. The door of the vacant house yielded to Holmes's expert attention, revealing the conspirators in the midst of their final preparations. Marie Dubois knelt beside a sophisticated optical device mounted on a tripod, her face illuminated by the pale glow of a shielded lantern as she adjusted the focus to observe Morrison's study. Beside her, the gentleman was assembling a complex apparatus of glass tubes and ceramic vessels, the acrid scent of exotic alkaloids emanating from his careful preparations. "Good evening, Mademoiselle Marie Dubois," Holmes announced as he stepped into the circle of lamplight, his voice carrying that particular authority that had confronted countless criminals. Or should I say the real Marie Dubois, sister to Claudette, who perished in the Lille machinery 5 years past? The woman rose with fluid grace, her composed facade finally dropping to reveal the passionate intensity that had driven her elaborate campaign of revenge. "Monsieur Holmes," she acknowledged, with a slight inclination of her head, her French accent, now pronounced and unguarded. "I wondered when you would penetrate our careful preparations. You arrive at the precise moment of our triumph." Her companion proved less composed, making a desperate lunge for a ceramic capsule that would have released concentrated alkaloid vapors throughout the confined space. Holmes's walking stick descended with surgical precision, sending the device skittering harmlessly across the floorboards, while Lestrade's constables secured both prisoners with professional efficiency. "Dr. Jean-Baptiste Moreau," Holmes continued, his keen gaze fixed upon the captured chemist, "former professor of toxicology at the University of Lille, dismissed following your public criticism of industrial safety practices. Your expertise in South American alkaloids, combined with Mademoiselle Dubois' theatrical talents and intimate knowledge of the victim's psychological vulnerabilities, created a partnership capable of orchestrating this elaborate campaign of terror." Marie Dubois lifted her chin with defiant pride, her dark eyes blazing with unquenchable fire. "They murdered my sister as surely as if they had pushed her into those machines themselves. Claudette died because English merchants valued profit over human life, and justice demanded that they experience the terror they had inflicted upon innocent workers." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his expression carrying both understanding and regret for the tragedy that had spawned such elaborate vengeance. "Yet your methods transformed legitimate grievance into calculated murder, mademoiselle. The whispering gloves may have spoken of justice, but they whispered only death." As the prisoners were secured and their apparatus carefully catalogued as evidence, Holmes examined the sophisticated equipment that had made their psychological warfare possible. The optical device revealed modifications that allowed detailed surveillance of their victims' private moments, while Dr. Moreau's chemical preparations demonstrated scientific knowledge of the highest order applied to the darkest purposes. The case of the Whispering Gloves had reached its conclusion through the capture of adversaries whose sophistication and determination had challenged even Holmes's considerable abilities. Yet as they prepared to depart the scene of their final confrontation, the detective's expression suggested that while justice had been served, the deeper questions raised by the conspiracy would continue to resonate through the corridors of power, where industrial responsibility and human conscience maintained their eternal struggle for supremacy. The fog swirled around the constables as they secured the prisoners and their elaborate apparatus, each piece of evidence carefully catalogued under Holmes's watchful supervision. Marie Dubois maintained her dignified composure even in defeat, her dark eyes still burning with the passionate conviction that had driven her elaborate campaign of vengeance. Dr. Moreau remained professionally detached, his scientific mind no doubt calculating the legal consequences while observing how efficiently the authorities dismantled months of meticulous preparation. Holmes examined the sophisticated surveillance equipment one final time before it was sealed as evidence, noting modifications that revealed intimate familiarity with each victim's domestic routines. The leather-bound journal containing psychological profiles proved most disturbing, its pages documenting not only the completed targets, but additional textile manufacturers whose names suggested the conspiracy's ambitions had extended far beyond the original Lille participants. Your operations required considerable resources and international coordination, Holmes observed, his penetrating gaze fixed upon Marie Dubois as the constables prepared for transport. The specialized equipment, continental suppliers, and extended surveillance could not have been sustained by two individuals alone. Marie lifted her chin with defiant pride, her voice carrying the passionate intensity that had sustained years of careful planning. The families of Lille's victims contributed what they could spare from their poverty, while certain French industrialists provided support for what they considered a righteous cause. We were not alone in believing that English merchants required education regarding their moral responsibilities toward foreign workers. As the prisoners were conveyed to Scotland Yard under heavy guard, Holmes, Watson, and Lestrade returned to Baker Street, where the collected evidence could be examined with proper thoroughness. The familiar gaslight of their sitting room cast warm illumination over the artifacts of their investigation, the Whispering Gloves, ceramic capsule fragments, annotated botanical texts, and the threatening correspondence that had initiated their deadly game. Holmes positioned himself before the fireplace, his grey eyes reflecting the satisfaction of a complex puzzle finally resolved. Watson, the case of the Whispering Gloves represents a fascinating confluence of calculated revenge, scientific ingenuity, and psychological manipulation. Our adversaries orchestrated a campaign that combined legitimate grievance with criminal methodology to create something truly unprecedented in my experience. The detective lifted one of the white kid gloves, flexing it gently to produce that eerie whisper that had terrified so many. These instruments were far more sophisticated than mere theatrical props. The whispering effect was achieved through controlled friction between specially treated French chalk and crystalline particles embedded within the leather. When flexed, they created an unsettling acoustic phenomenon designed to prey upon the victim's guilt, suggest supernatural intervention. Holmes dusted his handkerchief with residue from the glove's seams, the powder glittering under his magnifying glass like malevolent frost. However, the true lethality lay not in the audible whispers, but in the chemical preparation. Dr. Moreau's expertise in toxicology enabled him to develop a sophisticated delivery system using South American alkaloids, primarily belladonna derivatives, that induce terrifying hallucinations while remaining virtually undetectable in post-mortem examination. Watson leaned forward with professional interest as Holmes explained the evolution of their methods. Initially, with Harrington, they relied primarily on dermal absorption through the treated gloves combined with psychological pressure. The victim's natural nervous disposition and the elaborate theatrical preparation proved sufficient to induce fatal cardiac distress. But they refined their approach considerably, Holmes continued, producing the ceramic capsule fragments. These ingenious devices represented Dr. Moreau's masterpiece of applied chemistry. Impregnated with concentrated alkaloids and coated with heat-sensitive resin, they were designed to release their contents gradually when exposed to warmth. The conspirators studied their target's habits meticulously. Sir Marcus's retreat to his fireplace when distressed, Lord Ashworth's use of heated implements, Morrison's evening routine near the hearth. The detectives' exposition revealed the full scope of their adversary's psychological insight. Each victim received personalized treatment designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities. The threatening letters created mounting anxiety, while the delivery of whispering gloves provided a focus for their guilt and terror. The chemical agents then transformed natural remorse into hallucinogenic nightmare, creating visions so vivid and terrifying that the victims literally frightened themselves to death. Holmes turned to address the broader implications of their discovery. Edmund Vail's manipulation demonstrates their sophisticated understanding of human psychology. They exploited his genuine guilt and financial desperation to create a convenient scapegoat, while his initials on commercial orders provided false evidence pointing away from the true conspiracy. Vail believed he was assisting in moral reckoning, never suspecting he was being used as an instrument of misdirection. The systematic nature of the campaign became clear as Holmes outlined their methodology. Mademoiselle Dubois established herself as Madame Dubois, a continental researcher whose inquiries appeared academic while gathering intelligence about her target's routines, relationships, and psychological vulnerabilities. Her varying accent and persistent curiosity about private correspondence were elements of an elaborate masquerade that allowed intimate access to information crucial for their success. Watson marveled at the complexity of the deception as Holmes demonstrated how each element had been carefully orchestrated. The conspiracy's strength lay in its dual nature, psychological terror that broke down the victims, resistance combined with scientific precision that delivered the fatal blow. They learned from each successive application, refining their methods and growing bolder until their need to witness their final triumph became their undoing. Holmes's grey eyes held that familiar gleam of intellectual satisfaction as he concluded his exposition. The partnership between Marie Dubois and Dr. Moreau represented a formidable alliance of complementary skills. Her theatrical talents and intimate knowledge of the victim's guilt, combined with his scientific expertise and access to exotic compounds. Together they created a form of justice that operated through conscience rather than conventional legal mechanisms, though their methods transformed legitimate grievance into calculated murder. As the full scope of the elaborate conspiracy was finally revealed, Watson felt both admiration for Holmes's deductive powers and soberness at the tragedy that had spawned such sophisticated vengeance. The whispering gloves had indeed spoken of justice, but their whispers had carried only death, leaving behind questions about industrial responsibility and moral accountability that would continue to resonate long after the immediate perpetrators faced legal consequences. The case of the whispering gloves had demonstrated once again that even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises must eventually yield to methodical investigation and logical deduction, though Holmes's expression suggested awareness that the deeper conflicts revealed by their investigation would require solutions far beyond the scope of detective work, no matter how brilliant its application. The following morning brought crisp November sunlight streaming through the windows of Baker Street, illuminating the scattered remnants of their investigation, as Holmes prepared his final report for Scotland Yard. The mysterious gloves lay silent upon his desk, their whispering voices forever stilled now that their chemical secrets had been exposed to rational analysis. Watson observed his friend's methodical documentation with familiar satisfaction, though something in Holmes's manner suggested deeper contemplation of the moral complexities their investigation had revealed. Inspector Lestrade arrived promptly at 10 o'clock, bearing news that brought closure to the various threads of their complex case. Marie Dubois has provided a complete confession, Holmes, maintaining her actions were justified by the systematic cover-up that followed the Lille tragedy. Dr. Moreau proved more cooperative regarding technical aspects, apparently fascinated by the opportunity to explain his chemical innovations to someone capable of appreciating their sophistication. The inspector consulted his notebook with evident satisfaction. Edmund Vale has been cleared of all charges related to the deaths, though his manipulation serves as a sobering reminder of how genuine guilt can be exploited for criminal purposes. Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his grey eyes reflecting the weight of moral judgment that extended far beyond criminal prosecution. Their methods were undeniably murderous, Inspector, yet their fundamental grievance possessed legitimate foundation. The industrial negligence that caused those deaths in Lille was indeed covered up through coordinated deception and financial manipulation. The detective rose and moved to the window, his sharp profile etched against the morning light as he considered the broader implications. Sir Marcus Pemberton continues his recovery under medical supervision, the chemical exposure having been arrested before permanent damage occurred. His survival provides crucial confirmation that the deaths resulted from terror-induced cardiac failure rather than direct poisoning. Mr. Morrison, spared by our timely intervention, has expressed profound gratitude while beginning to confront the moral weight of his past actions. Watson joined his friend at the window, observing the normal bustle of London street life that continued unchanged despite the extraordinary drama that had unfolded. Their victims certainly bore moral responsibility for the Lille tragedy, but did that justify such elaborate and calculated revenge? That question, my dear Watson, transcends detective work and enters the realm of moral philosophy, Holmes replied, his voice carrying the measured tone he reserved for complex ethical considerations. The conspiracy we unraveled represents a perversion of justice, yet it emerged from genuine injustice that conventional legal mechanisms failed to address. Marie Dubois and her allies created their own court of moral reckoning when official channels proved inadequate. Holmes returned to his desk where the evidence lay arranged in precise order for final documentation. The psychological profiles our adversaries compiled revealed intimate knowledge that went far beyond normal investigation. They studied these men with the thoroughness of physicians diagnosing disease, identifying exactly which pressures would prove most effective in breaking their resistance. The detective lifted the annotated botanical text, its margins filled with careful observations about alkaloid preparation and psychological application. Their scientific approach to terror represented something genuinely innovative in criminal methodology. Dr. Moreau's expertise enabled them to create effects that appeared supernatural while remaining entirely chemical in nature, exploiting the victim's guilt to make them complicit in their own destruction. Holmes demonstrated once more how the whispering gloves achieved their eerie effects, the French chalk and crystalline particles creating their unsettling acoustic phenomenon, while embedded alkaloids provided dermal absorption that intensified psychological pressure. The conspiracy's strength lay in its dual nature: psychological terror that broke down resistance, combined with scientific precision that delivered the fatal blow. They learned from each successive application, refining their methods until their need to witness their final triumph became their undoing. As Holmes sealed the evidence for official presentation, he reflected on the case's broader significance. The Whispering Gloves spoke of conscience as much as vengeance, Watson. Their victims died not merely from chemical agents, but from the weight of accumulated guilt they had carried for years without acknowledgement or atonement. Edmund Vale's manipulation particularly troubles me, as it demonstrates how genuine remorse and financial desperation can be exploited to serve criminal purposes while the victim believes himself an instrument of divine justice. The detective moved to the fireplace, consigning his rough notes to the flames while preserving official documentation. Marie Dubois and Dr. Moreau will face justice for their crimes, yet the fundamental issues that drove their conspiracy remain unaddressed. Industrial accidents continue to claim workers' lives, while responsibility is shifted through legal maneuvering and financial manipulation. Holmes settled into his familiar chair, reaching for his pipe with the characteristic gesture that marked transition from active investigation to philosophical reflection. This case has reminded me that even the most brilliant detective work can only address symptoms rather than underlying causes. We have captured the instruments of vengeance, but the conditions that created such desperate need for alternative justice remain unchanged. As the morning progressed, Holmes's attention was already turning toward other matters demanding his analytical powers. A telegram from Birmingham requested consultation regarding suspicious deaths in a textile mill, while correspondence from Manchester described industrial accidents bearing suspicious resemblances to the Lille tragedy. The detective's keen eye had detected the faint outline of a new problem brewing, perhaps involving a missing emerald and a disgruntled opera singer whose case awaited his unique talents. "The gloves have stopped their whispering, Watson," Holmes observed, his grey eyes holding that familiar gleam of intellectual satisfaction, tempered by awareness of deeper mysteries. "But the voices of conscience they represented will continue to speak wherever human greed overshadows moral responsibility. Perhaps that is the most important lesson our mysterious adversaries have taught us, that justice delayed or denied will eventually find its own expression, though not always in forms that civilized society can approve." The great detective's expression suggested that while they had successfully unraveled the conspiracy's elaborate mechanism, the broader questions it raised about industrial responsibility and moral accountability would continue to resonate through corridors of power where human conscience and commercial interest maintained their eternal struggle. The case of the Whispering Gloves had concluded with characteristic intellectual triumph, yet it left behind uncomfortable truths about the world in which they lived, truths that no amount of brilliant deduction could entirely resolve. Holmes puffed thoughtfully on his pipe, his mind already drifting toward new challenges while the morning fog began to lift from Baker Street, revealing another day of mysteries waiting to be solved by the world's first consulting detective.